Okay, we're going to continue with a discussion of the female sexual body, and we're going to start with the external structures. So, just like I started the male external structures with a picture that I got off the internet of a dog that looks like a furry penis, I found this scarf that Fendi designed that a lot of people have commented looks a whole lot like vulva. So the word vulva refers to the external structures of the female body that are, anything that is in the genital region, anything that's external. So this picture, this scarf is actually a pretty good depiction. I think you have to look at it upside down to really get the full effect. But let's go ahead and just look at a scientific diagram. Okay. So here we have the group of structures that as a whole would be referred to as the vulva. So that would extend from the very top down to the perineum. Some people call it the perineum. There's different ways to pronounce it. So everything that is included in what you might think of as the word genitals, but as long as it's outside and it could be seen from the outside. So let's just go ahead and start at the top. The Mons Venerus is referring to that area of skin that is cushioned beneath it with a layer of fat, and then underneath that would be the pubic bone. So the Mons Venerus is really a structure that's kind of padded to protect the pubic bone. It oftentimes is covered with pubic hair. In the adult female, it might be removed oftentimes by the adult female. The Labia Majora usually has pubic hair also in a mature female. The term Labia Majora technically means, or literally means, the major lips or the main lips. So these would be the outside of the opening that would be around the vestibule of the vagina. Usually covered with pubic hair is an easy way to tell Labia Majora from Labia Minora. The Labia Minora are inside of the Labia Majora, but they may not be hidden within that. For some women, the Labia Minora protrude beyond the Majora, and for other women, they are inside. It's, just anatomical variations. It can also be related to the level of arousal that the woman might be experiencing. The picture that you're seeing here is more likely associated. You'd see this kind of Labia Minora being open like this when a woman is more aroused than when she's just sort of sitting around. Generally, the Labia Minora are together, and in fact, they oftentimes will sort of through surface tension, I guess is the only word that you could really use to describe it, because it has to do with moisture sort of holding things together. So the Labia Minora oftentimes are sort of together, and then with arousal, as blood flow starts to go in there, it'll open the Labia Minora, or through urination, or certain postures, sitting in certain ways, or things like that. That'll open the Labia Minora also. It's not their natural state necessarily to be open, like this picture sort of implies. The Labia Minora never have pubic hair on them, so that's a really good way to distinguish Minora from Majora. There's also a fatty layer underneath the Majora that's not present in the Minora. So now we're getting back to the top there. You see the clitoral hood, and this would be directly analogous to the foreskin in the male. Analogous means comparable or sort of equivalent. The clitoral hood definitely starts from the same fetal tissue as the foreskin of the penis does. So the clitoral hood is above the clitoral glands. What we're seeing from the outside is just the glands of the clitoris. With arousal, more of the shaft might reveal itself. But in a typical just sort of resting female, the clitoral glands would be sort of retracted under the clitoral hood, protected and stuffed just like the foreskin does for the penis. So very exact same structures. The clitoral glands has the exact same number of nerve endings as the penis glands does, but the clitoral glands is like 1/20th the size of the penile gland. So it's a lot smaller surface area with the same number of nerve endings on it. The urethral opening is where urine is going to pass. So one big difference between male and female, glands is that in the male, the urethra passes through the penile glands, whereas in the female, it passes through below the glands of the clitoris. So the clitoris doesn't have any other function. The penis has the dual function of passing urine and then also passing ejaculate. For the female, the clitoris is solely for pleasure. There's nothing else that it does. The vaginal opening is visible in an external examination. You can see the opening of the vagina. In fact, this area around the vagina inside the minora that includes the urethral opening and the vaginal opening, we call that the vestibule of the vagina, which sounds kind of, if you know what a vestibule is, that sounds kind of funny. It's like the doorstep of the vagina. And then in this picture, you can kind of see a hymen. This would be an intact female who's never had anything that penetrated her vagina that was large enough to actually disrupt her hymen. It's really important to realize that not all women have hymen. It's not necessarily even present at birth for some baby girls. And not all women lose their hymen through all sexual contacts. So it's not really a good measure of, this old-timey idea of virginity and, that hymen should be intact to prove that this woman has never had sexual contact. We now realize that not all women have hymens. Not all hymens get, completely removed through sexual contact. So it's a very misleading structure. I thought I'd share with you some pictures of some variations in hymen. These are all drawings, so don't be afraid. And these are not complete. There are lots of different ways that the hymen can look. This one's called an annular hymen, and it's sort of equidistant all the way around the opening of the vagina. This one's called a septate hymen. It has a septum in it, just like your nose has a septum, right? It's that little dividing area there. And the skin has just stayed, in contact is all I'm thinking of. The skin is continuous across the opening. This is called a Cribriform Hymen, where it's got openings in it, but it's got a lot of closure, right? It kind of looks like a lace pattern or something, or eyelet. And this kind of hymen, the openings can be very small, so small that like menstrual fluid might have a difficult time passing, like the larger pieces that might come out during menstruation. And then here's what is like sort of the stereotypical, this is what a hymen looks like kind of picture. It's just sort of what they call paris. Paris means that you haven't had coitus in this hymen. The assumption is that coitus would rupture a hymen, and oftentimes it does, but oftentimes other things do, right? Can you imagine if you had a cribriform hymen and use tampons? I mean, obviously it's going to have to, that cribriform is going to have to at least be partially severed in order for a tampon to be inserted. There used to be these old wives' tales about hymens that, girls shouldn't ride bikes because it would break their hymen, or that they shouldn't use tampons because it'll break their hymen. Like it was something that needed to, be protected, like a crystal vase or something like that, that it was super valuable to have an intact hymen, and you wouldn't want to break it, kind of thing. We even have phrases that we use to describe a person who has had their first sexual intercourse and they bled as a result of it. We have phrases like, popped their cherry, things like that, to indicate that the person has, that this female has had her virginity removed along with her hymen, right? And it's a really interesting mindset or a throwback to maybe some older times when, really there were no ways to prevent pregnancy or things like that. And so, and you had arranged marriages and other kinds of things that would make it really important to a potential mate that the female has never had sexual contact, because that would ensure that the husband is not going to be cuckolded, right? Tricked into thinking that he's married a person who is not pregnant and she really is, and he's going to end up rearing somebody else's offspring. So you can kind of imagine that in an antiquated time, when any potential sexual contact resulted in pregnancy or had a really strong probability of resulting in pregnancy, that this might have been a really important measure or metric to ensure that the husband's not going to be cuckolded. But in modern times, it is absolutely less important. And there are lots of, issues surrounding the value of the hymen that still persist, right? The idea of losing your virginity and things that are still tied very strongly to the hymen, rather than to what they probably should be tied to, which is the emotional issues that go along with losing your virginity. In any way, it doesn't have to be coitus, right? Losing your virginity in lots of ways has impacts on our psychological sense of self and autonomy and a whole bunch of other things. It's not just about penile vaginal sex. And so it's such a simplification to worry about hymen, right? So can you break your hymen while riding a bicycle? Well, I mean, I don't know. Anything's possible, I guess. But does that make a person not a virgin anymore? No. I don't know. How are you riding the bicycle? It's, there's the medical question. And then there's the sort of, what do you mean by that question, right? And the medical answer is, that the hymen can break for lots of reasons, and the hymen might even not be present in a woman. It has nothing to do with, previously having broken it and you didn't know. Variations in hymen. Now I'm going to finish up with our female genital mutilation slide. And, I had already talked about the big decisions and the two sides of the argument having to do with circumcision of a male. And I mentioned that a lot of those things aren't really present when we talk about the similar kinds of behaviors that surround female genital mutilation. Female genital mutilation is solely designed to control female sexuality. It is solely designed to protect the male from being cuckolded. You may have heard the term cuckold, and you might have heard it used in ways that aren't exactly the way that we mean them in science. What we're talking about with cuckolding is the idea that man could be left rearing somebody else's genetic offspring when he thinks that they are his own. That's the idea. This is not to imply that stepfathers are cuckolds. That's not, because a stepfather knows that these are somebody else's children and he's taken on the role. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about men who think that they are the father of these children when they really aren't. And then they invest their, parenting energy and stuff like that into offspring that they think are theirs, and then they really aren't. And you can imagine that that's kind of, again, an antiquated viewpoint, right? The idea that the only children worthy of my efforts are the ones that are genetically related to me, right? Now, a lot of us, let's be honest, we want to rear our own genetic offspring. So I'm not trying to suggest that that's a bad motive. I'm just saying that it's not as important in modern life that the offspring that we invest our energy in are our own biological ones. But around the world, there are places that still highly value proof of virginity at marriage and proof of fidelity anytime that the couples are separated or whatever. And so in those cultures where they really value those things, you're going to see higher rates of female genital mutilation. Okay, so let's just start off with a map of Africa as an example of an area where it's much more likely that female genital mutilation would be performed than in other places. It's rarely seen in other parts of the world, and we see, the red countries. It's between 3/4 and 99% of females having been mutilated in some fashion. There are a lot of different ways that it can be done. The most popular is to scarify, which means to cut or abrade the labia minora so that it will seal together as it heals. And then that will prevent any kind of sexual activity. And so at marriage, the husband has the confidence that his female partner has never had sex before. And in fact, on their wedding night, he either has to open up the scarring with his penis or sometimes with an object to get it to be able to, have coitus. That is not anything anywhere near the procedure that we call male circumcision. Like, this is intended deliberately to prevent girls or women from having unsanctioned sex. It's usually performed sometime between infancy and the age of 15, and usually it's done by a parent, usually the mom, and not very hygienically. And but it's part of a ritual, right? Like, it's something that everybody in the culture sort of expects and would look down on a family if they did not perform this act. And it's looked at as a cultural ritual. Now, in this picture, we have a little girl who's having it done by her mom, and it's a very upsetting picture to look at. It's a very upsetting thing to think about. Now, the things that can happen, you'll notice mom is using just a razor blade. In some cases, it's, broken bottle. In some cases, it's the edges of a torn aluminum can. It's sort of whatever they have. And of course, initially it can cause severe bleeding and infection and things like that. But what I was really interested in sharing with you guys is what can happen over the long term. You have this imprecise scarring of the labia minora that could in fact close the entire vestibule of the vagina, and you could end up with urine being blocked. You can have the development of cysts. Cysts are like little tumors that are full of some kind of fluid. It could be including bacteria in there. It could be more just regular fluid. And those can develop in the genital area. You can end up infertile as a result of this, as coitus becomes impossible. It could be that during childbirth there's significant tearing, and so there are these long-term effects on the woman, and then potentially on her offspring also, as they are harmed during the birth process. And what's really disturbing is that in the countries that have the red marks on that map, is that the husbands oftentimes will re-scarify their wives if they are going to be leaving on a hunting trip or something like that. And the idea being that, they want to make sure to protect their property. I mean, really, that's what they're saying, is that they're trying to make sure that their wife will remain, pure, so that when he gets back, she's not pregnant from somebody else in the village or something. So this is really significantly different than male circumcision. There are people who make the argument that male circumcision is intended to deprive men of sexual pleasure. I think the circumcised men in the world who are sitting here listening to me right now will agree that if they're experiencing reduced pleasure, it's nothing like what we're talking about with the female genital mutilation. That, in fact, it's so much not like it that they're not aware that they're experiencing reduced pleasure. Whereas the females who have been through this kind of mutilation, they oftentimes report, not just less pleasure, but like actual pain. Now, in other parts of the world, I wanted to talk about this kind of mutilation, but in other parts of the world, like India, has had a history of what they call female circumcision. And what they do is remove the clitoral hood. And you might think, well, that sounds analogous to male circumcision. But in female circumcision, by removing the clitoral hood, it removes the ability of the clitoris to retreat under the hood during plateau, which is the peak of sexual pleasure. And so the clitoris continues to get stimulated when, in fact, it would prefer to be under the hood. And so that actually removes pleasure from the female. So it's not like again, it's not like male circumcision at all in that way. During sexual arousal, the male penis, the foreskin always moves back and it stays back. And it isn't a benefit as you reach orgasm to actually have the foreskin over the glands. That just is not part of male sexual responding, but it is part of female sexual responding. And so to remove the clitoral hood removes sexual pleasure. So in both of these cases, and it's not about, some people have argued that the sexual pleasure that's removed in male circumcision is it takes the fun out of masturbation. That's not what's intended with female genital mutilation either. The intention is to control female sexuality so that they will be less likely to produce offspring that are not their husbands. So it's about controlling women and their fertility, removing their pleasure, because it doesn't really matter if they enjoy sex anyway. So it's a completely different thing. It's not about masturbation. It's about control. And so when people try and make sort of a parallel comparison, I don't think they really understand what's happening in female genital mutilation. And I don't think they really understand the sensitivity issues with male penises either. So I think there's a lot of, sort of equivalency, false equivalency being provided between these two procedures. All right. Well, so this was not a happy thing, just like I ended with the male penis. It was not a happy thing. So let's stop here and we'll come back and we'll talk about how about some breasts? That's a good, safe external structure. So we'll come back to that.